All right, let's get started. So as I said, my name is Pat Rutledge, and I'm with the Marco Island Historical Society. We are very pleased to be hosting this program this afternoon. The mission of the Historical Society here on Marco is to preserve and share the history and heritage of Marco and the surrounding community, but we embrace all history, and especially Florida history. So we are thrilled to have this topic to share with you this afternoon. So Dr. Kimberly Voss, PhD, is a professor of journalism at the University of Central Florida. Her research focuses on historical analysis of women journalists' careers, women's political influence, and the definition of women's news in the post-World War II years, many of them from Florida. She's published 5 books, including Reevaluating Women's Page Journalism in the Post-World War II Era and Women's Politicking Politely. She's published over 50 journal articles about women journalists. And her topic this afternoon is Florida Women, Advice, and Social Change. Newspaper advice columns started as lovelorn columns during yellow journalism as a way of showing that newspapers had a heart. These columns typically ran in the women's section of metropolitan newspapers, many in Florida, and included a mixture of content from traditional to progressive. Learn how these columns affected Floridian women's lives and relationships in the 1950s and the 1960s in this presentation. So welcome, Dr. Voss.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. As you mentioned, I study journalism history, a lot of it out of Florida, and specifically in the women's pages of newspapers. Women's pages in newspapers started in about the 1880s, the same time that the sports sections started in newspapers. And part of it was about selling items. It was a lot of advertising driven. But for many women writers, it was their chance to get into the paid workforce, to get in the public sphere. And being in Florida, as the population grew, was very special. I've enjoyed looking at the advice columns that we'll talk about today, because they really did document social change and documented how Florida was growing. So I do want to say that the Florida Humanities has funded this talk, an amazing group. Most of the women that I talk about, they did not have families, very few married. And so I do feel that I am a granddaughter or niece to make sure that these women's stories don't get lost in Florida history and in U.S. history. So just briefly, the women's pages were, again, all newspapers going back to about the 1880s. This is a photo of the New York Times women's page section, and you'll notice here it's all these women together. Women were not allowed to be part of the newsroom up until about the 1970s. They literally had to be on a room and usually a floor of their own. And the theory is that women could not handle the cursing that was in the newsroom, but I have read a lot of their papers and they curse just fine. There's nothing they have to be protected from. But the good news is that very few male editors read their section, so they could do whatever they wanted. And so some issues happened decades before in their sections, child abuse, domestic violence, pay inequity, were in the women's section well before they ever made it to the front pages of newspapers. So my favorite newspaper to look at in Florida overall is the Miami Herald. So this is 1950s at the Miami Herald newsroom. You'll notice again, it's all these women in this room. And I think I've written about every single one of them in this image. And again, they really made the most of where they were, even though they were obviously marginalized and not able to be part of the actual newsroom. They couldn't cover politics or sports or editorials, but they really did get to cover a lot of the things that mattered to women, to families. In the 1950s in particular, where this image is from, post-World War II, we saw giant growth in Miami. After the war, so many Midwestern men were part of the Servicemen's Pier. And so they returned after the war to South Florida. So we saw that giant population growth. Also, the Miami Herald in the 1950s and the 1960s was actually a statewide newspaper. So a lot of the things that we're able to look at really tell us what was happening in Florida for women's news. So the women's section was kind of known for what they call the 4 Fs. This is part of soft news: family, fashion, food, and furnishings. And these 4 things are typically considered as fluff. They didn't have value, which really, if you think about it, is rather silly. What more do we care about than our family, what we wear, what we eat, and where we live? And so I've worked very hard to make sure that the stories of these women get told, because overall they've been ignored by journalism history and historians overall. They also included brides and weddings, which gives us background what was happening in our state and in the country, and advice columns that we'll talk about today. And these advice columns go back to what they call the agony aunts in Britain in about 1900. And we saw things in the 1900s, the 1910s and 20s in America. And as we'll talk about today, these columns were important about understanding what was acceptable in behavior, in relationships, in the workplace. They really help document things that are important about understanding our social history. And whenever I talk about women's history, I always feel like I need to at least mention Marjorie Paxson. She was one that created the National Women in Media Collection that's housed in Missouri. She worked at the Miami Herald. She worked at the St. Pete Times. Prior to that, she was in the wire service. And she also worked in 2 Houston newspapers. So she was the one with her endowment that came through Gannett, which is the chain that has USA Today and Florida Today. She was the one that really established the place where journalists could put their papers. In fact, she's really established the only archive that you can look at multiple women journalists over time. And so I was lucky enough to get to interview her a few times, and just a truly amazing journalist. She was the 4th woman to be a publisher in the Gannett chain. So to talk a little bit about advice columnists, the most well-known was Dorothy Dix. This was a pen name. This was very common back in the name. Elizabeth Cochran was her actual name. And she was so popular with her column, which began in the 1930s to the 1950s, 60 million people read her at one point in time. So she had incredible reach. And her advice column was kind of typical of the ones that we kind of even still see today and the ones that came after her. And the basic idea here was you would write in if you had a question. Right, I'm arguing with my spouse, I'm having a problem with my parents, I'm having a problem in the workplace, and you would write in. And Dorothy would either write her own response back that she either agreed or disagreed with you or the other person. And sometimes she would go out and interview experts. So we see a lot in advice columnists at this point in time interviewing, say, a psychologist, or a lawyer, or somebody that had, significant knowledge about this topic. But these were things that mattered, and they would be shared. We know that 2 to 3 other people at least would share what they saw in the newspaper with these columns. And for some of the journalists, not always Dorothy, but for some of these journalists, they would actually write individual letters back if it didn't make it in the newspaper. So it was that almost kind of social media feel where they cared so much, they wanted to make sure that that person wasn't forgotten and their question wasn't overlooked. As we'll talk about today, there were several national syndicated columnists like Dorothy. Again, that was her pen name. Many of them had pen names that didn't use their actual names. But almost every regional newspaper had their own. So we'll talk about that with the Miami Herald a little bit. there's also something about this local question about what was happening in their communities that mattered. And these were widely read, and we know this now after research, read by women and men, even though they were in the women's section overall. So these syndicated columns, people from across the country would send in letters. And we know from some interviews that these readers that sent in their questions, would sit and wait for the newspaper to come to see if there was a response. They wanted to know what other people thought. Some of these columnists did what I just mentioned, where they wrote in themselves as columnists, or they interviewed somebody. But as we'll talk about today, some of these syndicated columns asked for other readers to send in their views, to see what they thought, which created a real conversation between the newspaper and their readers and the letter writers back and forth. And we also know that these things were real. There's often been questions, were these real letters that were sent in? I've gone through an archive in Miami, where that we'll talk about at the end today. And she kept all her letters, and on the side, she would write their actual names and their addresses and their phone numbers and all that sort of thing. So we know that these were real. Part of the question has become, not only did the columnists use pen names, they would create pen names for the letter writers. So, for example, out of Miami, Sunshine in Miami would be a letter writer. Concerned mom, bothered husband, that kind of thing. But we know they're real because we were able to see this through not just the Miami archive, but also in various archives of individual women across the country. So probably the most famous of all the syndicated columnists were Dear Abby and Ann Landers. Their actual name, Pauline Phillips and Eppie Lederer, they were identical twins and very competitive. And so one was in Chicago, one was in San Francisco. And a lot of what we know about social concerns and advice columns come from them, because everyone saved those columns are in all the archives and libraries and that sort of thing. And things really changed over time. In particular, Dear Abby, or Pauline Phillips, had real concerns about homosexuality. And it did evolve over time that she felt different things in later years. Ann Landers, or Eppie, she was very much against divorce. And so when she'd have a letter writer ask questions about a marriage, about a relationship, she would say, divorce is not an option, until her husband cheated on her. And she changed her mind about divorce. And typically these columns would have lots of space on the page. When Ann Landers, or Eppie, decided that she was going to announce her divorce, it was only one paragraph and the rest of that page was left blank. She wanted to stand out. She wanted to show that the things that she's gone through had mattered. And as both of them changed their mind on social issues over time, that was okay too, to see how we felt about social issues. Sylvia Porter was probably one of our country's most influential financial advice columnists. And this is going back to the 1940s, where women had questions about investing, about alimony, about how to take care of their children if they were a single parent. So Sylvia Porter was so important that she ended up becoming a consultant for the White House. She had that kind of power. And again, these were questions that weren't being asked anywhere else. And I think that's incredibly important too, to understand this about the advice columnists. These were people that didn't know who else to ask. So instead of asking, say, a family member, or as some of them said, I couldn't ask the religious person in my life, I couldn't ask my pastor or my priest. These advice columnists had a very important role. in helping. In Sylvia's position, it was financial, and she had a very strong financial background. Another thing I thought was interesting about Sylvia is her children took over her column, as did the children of Dear Abby and Ann Landers. It's the only part of journalism history that I know of that the children took over. And it really was about an understanding of their readership, that the children would take that on after they'd passed away or had retired. But people like Sylvia Porter sometimes get forgotten because they were in the women's section. But the financial advice that she gave was powerful and it was important, and it still works today, frankly. All newspapers had an advice columnist that I have found. Again, up until the early 1970s, most metro papers were aimed at white audiences. But there were Black newspapers that were very successful across the country, including in Florida. And Princess Mysteria was the advice column there, and she was syndicated in different Black newspapers. And researchers over time have found that her advice was a little different than the advice that was given in white metro papers. So, as I mentioned earlier, Ann Landers did not believe until divorce until it happened to her. That was not true with the advice that was often given in Black newspapers, where it was more likely to say, what's best for you? So it was much more likely that you would be told in a response to your letter that, you know, maybe you need to strike out on your own. Maybe you need to get a job and do these other things. But this was syndicated. And there were other food and fashion advice columns that were also in Black newspapers, also in Yiddish newspapers. The Bintel Brief is a great book because it gives us all that information. This advice column went back to 1906 and had a lot to do with how Jewish people coming to America could both assimilate but also have their own identity. And so the letters were fascinating about how was it that readers could kind of balance out being American without losing their culture. And so this went on for decades in the Yiddish newspapers. And again, the great part is we have a lot of papers from this column and a book that documents those letters. Ask Beth is one of my favorites. This was written out of Boston, written by Elizabeth Winship, but she went by Ask Beth. Things you can't ask your mother. And it's really something to read some of the things that Elizabeth wrote about in the day. And she also saved all the letters that she got from these teenagers in terms of proving that these letters were real. And so they are in an archive that we can't look at for another 50 years. That's how much she wanted to make sure she protected those letter writers. And the letters that are written, some of them could be written today. I have teenage children, a young child, and the same kinds of questions that I can hear them or their friends ask still work, even though this goes back into the 1960s. I would also say what's fascinating is that they really were questions they didn't think they could ask their mother or a teacher or, again, someone in their faith. They had no one else to ask. You know, we didn't have, obviously, the internet and that sort of thing in the 1960s. So these teenagers, this is a complete teenager column, would write letters to Elizabeth. So they'd have to come up with their question, get their stationery, get their stamp, get the address, send it off, and then have to wait to see what it was that Ask Beth would respond to. And this was true of several columnists that wrote just for teenagers. And I think that's just an amazing thing to think the service that these advice columnists had for teenagers and how few places teenagers really had to ask these kinds of questions. And sometimes they were simple, the length of a skirt that was acceptable or not, as well as fights with their parents. Some teens were very upset that their parents would make them babysit younger siblings, for example. And they would write Elizabeth, trying to get Elizabeth to be on their side. But just as often, Elizabeth would go, well, your parents raised you, you could take care of your siblings. So it wasn't always an automatic agreement, but that was clearly what a lot of teens were going for. And many newspapers had things, we'll talk about a Florida one in a minute, that were just based on teen questions and teen responses. And these things obviously mattered because they didn't have other people to ask those questions to. And I find that just to be such a powerful, powerful role for these advice editors. And again, Dear Abby and Ann Landers also briefly each had teen advice columns in addition to their regular columns as well. Hints from Heloise. Lots of folks know who Heloise is. Again, this is another example of where her daughter has taken over a column. And so Hints from Heloise were about homemaking, cleaning, some cooking, some parenting. And so Heloise was a woman who was in Honolulu. She was in Hawaii. And she was at a dinner party. This would have been, I want to say, the early 1960s. And she was at an event that there were lots of servicemen who were there. And at this cocktail party, Heloise said, I've always wanted to write a column for the newspaper. I want to talk to the other homemakers about the different things I know or that we could learn from each other. And that serviceman laughed in her face and said, that'll never happen. Well, she made it happen. There was a great women's page editor at the Honolulu Advertiser. And so she helped Heloise get this column. And it was a mix. It was a mix of Heloise talking about her own experiences, but most of the time it was because she had a really good maid who gave advice about things as you see here, how to get gum out of a kid's hair, how to save money on food, how to do various kind of cleaning in your home. She eventually moves to Texas. But to this day, Hints from Heloise is something that people often not only mention reading, but there's examples that if your letter got into Hints from Heloise, it might be included in your obituary. There was such a role because Heloise was in so many newspapers and had a very interesting life. And again, her daughter took over her column and still runs it today. So some of the advice column topics that we see, a lot of it is relationships, usually trying to answer a fight. I think this, my partner thinks this, what do you think? And usually coded in language that says, please agree with me. A lot of it was employment that we'll talk about in a minute. Women's employment was a real argument for many decades. And what's fascinating to me about arguments about should women work or not was these columns all ran in the women's pages. And as you saw in the earlier photos, the women's pages are full of women. So they often had to answer questions that were very demeaning to their employment. Parenting, again, a lot of the parenting issues that came up in the advice column could be mentioned today, you know, how late you can stay out, you know, what age can you date or go in a car with a boy, almost always a boy question on your own. Not just social issues. We'll look at an example out of Miami, but there were questions that came up that really predated what was going to happen next in terms of politics. These things were important. Food and recipes that we'll talk about. You know, there's a saying about women in newspapers that your name should only be in the newspaper 3 times. When you're born, when you get married, and when you die. I would definitely argue that if your recipe got in the newspaper, that was a really good number 4. Being a good cook mattered. It was a show-off moment, kind of. Having a great recipe mattered. And recipes were often sometimes power. And I'm sure most people know of at least somebody that was asked for a recipe of a dish and they wouldn't give it up because it was theirs. And so that was kind of a battle that happened in food advice columns. This last one I wanted to mention, because I was thinking about it as I was preparing for this talk this week, the scare over comic books. This was huge in advice columns, particularly in the 1950s. There was a real question about what comic books were going to do to children, that this was going to change everything, that our children were going to get into trouble, they were going to get into drugs, they were going to get arrested. But the language used in the comic book scare is very similar to book banning in Florida, about what's in a book and how to be almost kind of more scared of it than to examine why it might matter or be important under the First Amendment. So the comic book scare that's very big in advice columns definitely sounds similar to what we can hear today when we talk about book banning in Florida. So recipe requests, this was huge. So this is out of the Orlando Sentinel. Thought you would never ask. And most newspapers had something similar. So the recipe request would often be, say someone traveled and they tried a dish somewhere else. And so when they got home, they would ask the food editor or the readership, how do I make this dish? And what's really great is this is one of the best examples of community back and forth, because you would see other readers write in and go, oh, I was in Charleston, I had that. This is what it's made of. Or I used to live in Milwaukee. This is how you make this dish. And so it really was a conversation. I think a lot of what happened with the advice columns and in the women's sections in general were about almost kind of early social media. This is how they interacted. What was special about the Orlando Sentinel, and this is Dorothy Chapman's book, she had a couple. She was the food editor at the Orlando Sentinel, was that tourists that visited Disney World, they would try something and they wanted to make that same dish at home. But the challenge is when you are making a dish at Disney World, right? It's a lot of food. It's huge. And so part of what Dorothy did, she would work with the cooks and the chefs at Disney. How could you make this for a dinner party of 6, for example? But these advice columns that involved recipes were very common, I should say, across the country. So one of my favorite Florida advice columnist was Dorothy Ricker, who was out of Tampa. You see here the headline says, Dorothy Ricker answers teenage mail, and that was her specialty. She was all about teens. And she said that she felt that she had a lot of common sense, and that's why she was good at this. Poor Dorothy, though, she had this column for a very long time. It was syndicated across the country, again, out of Tampa. But poor Dorothy, one of her most famous columns was about the fact that she said, teenagers won't like Elvis for very long. Elvis will never last. Of course, I was writing this during the Elvis movie craze. So poor Dorothy, that's what she's best known for, was getting Elvis wrong. But she wrote to every single teen that wrote to her. So even if it didn't make it in the newspaper, Dorothy answered every teen's letter. She didn't want anyone to ever feel like their voices weren't heard, that what they had to say didn't matter. So my favorite of all of the Florida columnists, because I studied her so much, out of the Miami Herald, syndicated across the state, was the columnist Eleanor Hart. So she was really Eleanor Hazlitt Rattel. That was her actual name. She picked Eleanor Hart by simply taking her finger and going through the phone book. Landed on it, and that became her name. She had a journalism degree from Ohio State University, and she wrote for a newspaper up there before coming down to Miami. She came down on a train on her own in 1940, and she was out on the beach, and she saw a young man that she thought looked attractive, and she walked up and asked him out for a beer. She was a fun, assertive lady, and she wrote regular news. She had a fitness column. She wrote a lot about losing weight. Her weight fluctuated quite a bit. She was known for answering the phone in the Miami Herald women's section by saying, "How fat are you?" She was very there. And she wrote this column with a heart. And this is the stuff that I got to go through in her papers in Miami that was just wonderful, because she had the original letters. She would have the addresses, as I mentioned, and the phone numbers. And she would also write there who she'd interviewed to get this information. And it really was something to see the interaction between readers and Eleanor. So this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. So this was her column with a heart. And so she kept scrapbook after scrapbook I got to go through. So this is one of those columns. The headline is, "I've never loved my husband. I only feared being a spinster." And this is the kind of things that she would write about. And sometimes, again, she would respond herself. She might get an expert to respond. And there were also times that the readers would write in. And these were the kinds of things that it became abundantly clear in reading the original letters that these readers didn't feel like they could ask anyone else or tell anyone else. And so these advice columnists became their kind of mediated friends. They're the people that they could admit things to that family and friends might not be willing to hear. So the kinds of things we saw in Eleanor's section had to do with employment. There's a lot of complaints about women working, as we'll talk about in a minute, which again, I have to wonder what that felt like for some of these women because they were all responding as employees. Now, I will say that probably about half of the women wrote from home. There was a real thought that, again, women in the newsroom were problematic, and a few of them did have kids. In fact, there was one advice columnist that would answer letters, and the bus driver would come by and pick them up and drop them off at the newspaper office. But again, a lot of questions about employment for women who were working. Marriage and relationships were quite a lot of the letters, which range from very specific fights to kind of in general, am I ready to get married? Am I ready to get divorced? Is it okay to date this person who's different than I am? That sort of thing. Education, particularly as we got into the 1960s, a lot of questions about women going to college. And, sometimes it's easy to forget that women were not necessarily very welcome at many universities, particularly if they wanted to leave and have children. Until the Commission on the Status of Women in the 1960s, almost no college had a program where a woman could go back after, say, her kids were in school. And so education became a real question. And integration, particularly looking at what Eleanor wrote about in Miami, about the integration of neighborhoods. And I saw this in newspapers across the country, in Boston and Milwaukee, out in California. These were questions that readers and those that responded to readers were struggling with. So to talk a little bit about working mothers first, I want to kind of take apart for you a little bit about Eleanor Hart's section. So this was an example letter. "The mother who seeks employment outside the home, unless her husband is physically or mentally unable to work, should have the title of mother denied her. Perhaps these are harsh words, yet can a great proportion of the ills plaguing our society be attributed to the breakdown in family life?" And this was a pretty typical letter that was coming in, dismissing women who were working. Yet at the same time, what's not always mentioned was that many of these women were working because they were the sole providers. I mentioned Dorothy Chapman to you earlier, the food editor in Orlando. She raised 3 children by herself. And she didn't have anyone to help with the bills. And she would actually write in her section every Christmas about that. That she was working for money because she had to. So we have this working mother's letter out of Miami. And this is how Eleanor Hart responded. And she did this in bold, which meant the newspaper had to spend extra money because of the extra ink. And she responded, "The working mother lazy? Question mark. She works doubly hard because she has 2 jobs instead of 1. Few of her ilk," the term used earlier, "spend lavish amounts on maid service, gold-plated lunches, and fancy clothing. Her biggest money expenditure is competent daycare." And that was a thing that really only the women's section was writing about at that time, the need for daycare, and for daycare that was not so expensive that it couldn't be afforded by working women. We heard about education in Eleanor Hart's column. A mother wrote in, "My husband says a college education is wasted on women and you won't need a diploma to be a mother." Hart responded, "Is college wasted on women? Question mark. Certainly not. Not on all women at any rate." And again, Hart did have a degree from Ohio in journalism. So this has been when I talk about the advice columns, I've got lots more to say, but I always like to open to questions if I can.
So, Kimberly, while we're waiting for folks to put their thoughts into the Q&A, I actually had one or two things that I was thinking about while you were speaking, and perhaps we could start there. You know, the whole idea of some of these discussion topics, they haven't really changed, have they?
Nope.
When you look at things like inequality in the workplace for women and the cost of competent childcare and so forth, those are still very topical and very important today. What's your thought about that?
I think what was fascinating was that we had such early notice, right, about what women cared about. We knew this, going back really even, to the 1930s and 40s. We know things, during World War II, there was good daycare that was government sponsored, right? So we know that it can work. There was a time for that. And if you look at the women's sections post-World War II, there was definitely a push for women to go back into the home, kind of an anti-Rosie the Riveter, if you will. A lot of government studies about women who worked were going to lead to juvenile delinquents, for example. That was kind of a big thing that happened. Now, the interaction with the advice columnists that were in the women's section and women's clubs, that every city had several women's clubs. At one point in the 1950s and 60s in Miami, there were 1,000 women's clubs. A lot. And these women's clubs often took on the issues that were presented in the advice columns in the women's section. So, for example, the question about women working, the pushback there was that these children become juvenile delinquents, would get in trouble, would get arrested. So really, it was the women's clubs that came up with programs for juvenile justice that we still see to this day. They came up with some daycares, they came up with kindergartens and libraries. So it was really a partnership between the advice columnists, the women's pages, and the women's clubs that really helped change our communities and made our communities stronger and really helped families.
We do have some questions. Thank you. Thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Sure.
We do have some questions in chat. So here's the first. What
Sure.
makes Hart stand out in your mind above the syndicated ladies?
I think the local aspect of it, because she was really talking, she had been in Miami at that point, for more than 2 decades, and she stayed there for a while after that. And I think what she knew about her neighbors in Miami mattered because, again, Miami was growing very fast. And in some ways, Eleanor Hart was, I think, the voice that helped people understand what was happening, different neighborhoods, issues having to do with, again, gender and race and social class. And so I think it really was almost that hyper local. And we can see those examples in many cities. Almost every newspaper had at least one national syndicated, sometimes several, no matter how big it was. And they would almost always have at least one local. Sometimes it was one local kind of readership overall and one for teens. And sometimes the syndicated columnists competed. So, for example, Ann Landers and Dear Abby, one was in the Miami Herald and one was in the Miami News. So some of it was that competition too, particularly in this case, those two sisters who were very competitive about trying to find out what mattered. And sometimes it really was a local issue in some ways that mattered, whether it was food with the recipe advice columnists, because there were different regional interests. I remember up in Milwaukee, there was a fashion advice columnist, and she did not believe in miniskirts. And it wasn't because she was a prude or she didn't necessarily like the fashion. It was just too cold in the winter.
Okay. I have another question for you. And it is, I was hoping to learn something new about Harriet Beecher Stowe since her photo was up on this event.
I have to say, I can't help you with that. But one thing that I think historically about advice columnists I think is helpful. Eleanor Roosevelt had a long time advice column that was really very both matter of fact and funny. I guess I don't necessarily always think of Eleanor Roosevelt as being funny, but she was in her advice column. And she wrote a few for newspapers, but mostly for women's magazines. And Martin Luther King also was an advice columnist for Ebony. So there were some folks that we don't always think of as advice columnists that were doing this work, then went on to, again, being nationally known in other ways. I think sometimes people think about Erma Bombeck a little bit, who had syndicated. She gave good advice, and she was also very, very funny. But she also advocated for the Equal Rights Amendment, issues having to do with working mothers. So there was kind of this mix of women that aren't always known as advice columnists, but we're doing that work.
Thank you. What are some of the steps that led to integration, quote unquote, of women in newsrooms?
It was a kind of a mix of things. And again, we're going late 60s into the early 1970s. Part of it was really the women's liberation movement. There's a lot of questions about why women were being segregated in the photos I showed you at the beginning. Why aren't they throughout the newspaper? Gloria Steinem, for example, was very vocal that women should be in all parts of the newspaper, not just in the women's pages, and that we should get rid of the women's pages. And it was a great idea. It worked very well in theory, but it never worked in practice. In the years after the women's sections went away, they were turned into either feature sections or lifestyle sections. The women didn't get to get jobs in those other sections. And so they really kind of got lost. I mentioned to you Margie Paxson earlier. Twice she lost her job because of women's liberation movement positions. And so you had this idea that women should go into other sections, and they didn't. And so for that reason, really the voices that were helping women in the 1950s and 60s were gone. I should say that by 1972, Gloria Steinem said she was wrong, but at that point, the sections were pretty much gone. The second reason that those sections went away and things changed was litigation. There were several lawsuits, including at the New York Times, that forced editors to make some changes. And so that, again, the most well-known one was at the New York Times, also at the Detroit News. At the Chicago Tribune, they simply started to promote a particular woman because they were afraid of getting sued. And so those were kind of a combination of things, social change within a social movement and court cases that led to the change. But if you look at how topics were covered in the 50s and the 60s in newspapers regarding women, they're not there that much in the 70s and in the 1980s.
So just as a follow-up, I'm curious, would you say, though, that today that integration is fairly complete?
No.
No.
The New York Times had one woman top editor, and it only lasted for a couple months, versus if you look at previous male editors that stay there forever. If you look at the last presidential election, there was almost no women covering the presidential election. And if you took out USA Today, there were almost none. I think sometimes it feels like there's been progress, but there's not. If you look at the top editors, editors in really important positions, it's very rarely women. And I think part of the challenge of that is going back to the 1980s. Female students have been a vast majority of journalism students. So it seems like everything's getting better, that it's different, that there's a sense of integration, at least based on gender alone. But then most of those students do not end up going into journalism. They end up going into, say, public relations, for example. And when it comes to race, we are woefully not even close to equality. And, it's a hard time for newspapers because as we have these mass layoffs, it's hard sometimes to know what to fight for a little bit, I think, from an HR standpoint. But yeah, women have never got close to equality at newspapers anyway. Not really much at TV stations, but I'm better at newspapers.
Well, thank you. I don't have any other questions in chat. Is there anything that you would like to leave us with this afternoon in terms of this really, really fascinating topic?
Thank you. These advice columns still exist. You can see them whether online from a newspaper, you can see them whether they're a purely online publication. And they really do, I think, share how times are changing a little bit, just even the language that's used sometimes. But I invite you to take a look at that. Lots of publications will also republish old letters from advice columnists that were sent in and answered. And they really do kind of let you know some things that are very specific, like the danger of Elvis in comic books, for example. But there are things like, recipes that come back into style, or questions about child care and domestic violence and those kinds of things that really still work today.